Hello, and welcome to Phalanx History. In this episode, we will be covering the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. The Sepoy Mutiny was a large but ultimately unsuccessful uprising of conscripted Indian soldiers against the ruling East India Trade Company. With the size and scope of the uprising being larger than a mutiny but smaller than a revolution, it has led to disagreement among historians of how to classify the event, with it being referred to by a number of names such as the Sepoy Mutiny, the Great Rebellion, the Revolt of 1857, the Indian Insurrection, and the First War of Independence. Regardless of what name you attribute this event, one fact remains constant among historians, that it shook the British Empire to its core. The Sepoy Mutiny cannot be attributed to one event, but rather a culmination of cultural and religious frictions that accumulated over time. The term Sepoy refers to the local Indians who were conscripted and served in the military of the East India Trade Company. The Sepoy forces were comprised of three major armies referred to as presidencies. These presidencies were Bombay, Madras, and Bengal. While the Bombay and Madras presidencies were comprised of lower caste recruits, the Bengal presidency was primarily composed of high caste Hindus and wealthy Muslims. Initially, the Bengal presidency was allowed to observe many of its cultural and religious practices so as not to offend its high caste recruits. However, incremental policy changes by the East India Trade Company inevitably led to friction among the high caste members of the Bengal presidency. Lack of promotion and recruitment of lower castes resulted in growing discontent among the ranks of the soldiers. Another point of contention was decreased pay. As the East India Trade Company annexed more and more territory, such as Awadh and Punjab, the Bengal soldiers were no longer entitled to premium pay, due to the fact that it was no longer considered a foreign mission. Perhaps most concerning was the General Services Enlistment Act of 1856, which mandated recruits of the Bengal presidency to serve overseas. This was of particular concern because the activity of serving overseas could potentially lead to loss of caste. And although the act stated it was only to apply to new recruits, it was enough to plant seeds of doubts amongst the ranks of the Bengal presidency. Discontent with the East India Trade Company spanned beyond the military to Indian society at large. Indian nobility was increasingly at odds with the East India Trading Company over its land annexation policies. The most controversial policy being the doctrine of lapse, which is widely associated with James Braun Ramsay, who accelerated its usage during his tenure as Governor General of the East India Trading Company from 1848 to 1856. The policy stipulated that territory could be annexed by the company if the ruler was deemed incompetent or died without a male heir. This practice incensed Indian nobility, who viewed the doctrine of lapse and its applications as widely illegitimate. This sentiment was further accelerated by a provision that prohibited the appointment of an heir to be an adopted son or family member. Resentment for the East India Trading Company extended beyond the Indian nobility due to the banning of various religious rituals. One ritual cited by historians as being distinctly contentious is that of sati. Sati is a practice in which a widow would engage in self-immolation upon the funeral pyre of her deceased husband. The flashpoint for the mutiny is widely agreed to be the Enfield rifle. The new rifle design employed paper cartridges that were greased in order to load the ball bearing into the barrel of the gun. The loading procedure for these rifles required soldiers to tear the cartridges with their mouth, and it is speculated this is where the idiom "bite the bullet" originated from. This loading procedure became controversial when rumors spread amongst the sepoys that the cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, both of which would violate Hindu and Muslim religious doctrines. Although attempts were made to assuage their concerns, little progress was made to quell the growing discontent amongst the rank-and-file sepoy soldiers. On March 29, 1857, in a military base outside of Calcutta, one of the first open acts of defiance occurred. A soldier by the name of Mangal Pandey, incensed by the religious transgressions of the East India Trading Company, attacked several of his commanding officers, with what was described as a religious zeal. Mangal Pandey's commanding officer was ordered to intervene and put an end to the act of defiance, but the order was refused, and all but one of the sepoy soldiers present stood by and watched, as Mangal Pandey became a living expression of the seething rage and discontent felt by a growing number of Indian soldiers and citizenry. When it became clear that his comrades would not join him in open rebellion, Mangal Pandey attempted to take his own life by placing his rifle against his chest and pulling the trigger with his toe. His attempt to take his own life was ultimately unsuccessful, and Mangal Pandey and his commanding officer were sentenced to death by hanging. Sepoy soldiers who did not intervene to stop Mangal Pandey were dishonorably discharged from the military and sent home. Although his actions failed to incite open rebellion, Mangal Pandey is considered a folk hero by many Indians to this day, and even received his own feature-length film in 2005 entitled Mangal Pandey: The Rising. Following the Mangal Pandey incident, tensions continued to simmer until they once again boiled over in the city of Meerut. During April of 1857, George Carmichael Smith, commanding officer of the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry, ordered 90 of his men to perform firing drills. These firing drills were to be performed with the Enfield rifle and their controversial grease cartridges. When the men protested the use of these cartridges, the commanding officer unsympathetically demanded that they bite the bullet. All but 5 of the cavalry soldiers refused to participate in the firing drills and rejected their bullet cartridges. These soldiers were swiftly court-martialed and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. Their fellow sepoys looked on in horror as they were paraded through town, stripped of their uniforms, and placed in shackles. The harsh punishment given to the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry infuriated the sepoy soldiers stationed in Meerut, and by the next day, the garrison was in open revolt, attacking various East India Trading Company military installations. Fighting raged through the night, and when the dust settled, a number of British civilian and military personnel had been killed. Once the fighting in Meerut had quieted, the sepoys marched 40 miles to Delhi, where the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar II lived in a largely ceremonial capacity. The arriving sepoy soldiers beseeched the emperor to acknowledge and recognize their rebellion. And by all accounts, Bahadur Shah was initially hesitant, but as Delhi soldiers and members of the royal court began to join the rebellion, he conceded and agreed to acknowledge and support the rebellion. Delhi was in open revolt. The sepoys swept across the city, dispatching of East India Trading Company soldiers and capturing military supplies. Throughout the course of the fighting, many Indian and British Christians were killed, and the remaining British residents of Delhi fled to Flagstaff Tower on the outskirts of town, before dispersing into the surrounding countryside. Some were aided by sympathetic villagers in the surrounding towns, while others met a less fortunate fate. When the dust had settled, the sepoys were now in possession of the city of Delhi, and the rebellion had spread throughout central and northern India, with notable uprisings in Delhi, Lucknow, Kanpur, Jhansi, and Gwalior. Support for the rebellion was not universal amongst cultural and religious groups in India. The Madras and Bombay presidencies remained largely loyal, as did Muslims and Sikhs, who due to historical grievances did not want to see a return to Mughal rule. The British Empire was losing their grasp on India and was left scrambling to come up with a plan. Let's see how each of the rebelling cities fared over the course of the 1857 rebellion. The Siege of Delhi, July 1857 through September 1857. The spontaneity and rapid pace of the rebellion caught the British off guard. They were slow to mount a counterattack due to being vastly outnumbered. Troops were diverted from the Crimean War and from China to assist in quelling the Sepoy Mutiny. By late June, British forces succeeded in capturing a ridge outside of Delhi, but with tens of thousands of mutineers inside the city, they were unable to mount an assault. The British forces held their position outside of Delhi for months, enduring disease, summer heat, and repeated attacks from sepoy soldiers in Delhi. It wasn't until early September that the British forces were reinforced and a siege became feasible. Siege guns battered the gates of Delhi from September 7th through the 14th, and after a week-long onslaught of cannon fire, on September 14th, an attempt to storm the city was made. British soldiers began pouring into the city, and the following week consisted of brutal street fighting, house to house, to clear out the sepoy soldiers. Wide-scale looting and pillaging were carried out as reprisal for sepoy actions during the taking of the city. And by the end of the week, Delhi had been retaken. Bahadur Shah had been arrested, and his 2 sons had been executed. Atrocities at Kanpur, June 1857 through September 1857. Kanpur is a city of strategic importance due to its position on the Ganges River and its proximity to various trade routes. In 1857, the sepoy soldiers stationed at Kanpur began to rebel, and Sir Hugh Macy Wheeler and his men became under siege, along with the British women and children who remained in Kanpur. The siege lasted for 3 weeks, with the besieged suffering from continuous casualties and a lack of food and water. The leader of the rebelling sepoys, Nana Sahib, made an offer of safe passage to the remaining British soldiers, an offer which General Wheeler accepted. The British were escorted to a dock on the Ganges River, where they expected to find boats that would take them to safe passage. Instead, they found sepoy soldiers staging an ambush. The sepoy soldiers opened fire and ended up murdering most of the British. The remaining, mostly women and children, were slaughtered and their bodies were discarded down a well. There is some dispute amongst historians of if this was a staged ambush. Some historians hypothesize that it might have been an accidental discharge of a weapon which led to an all-out melee and a bloodbath. Regardless of what happened, one thing is for certain: this event served to galvanize support for the war effort in India back in England. Shortly after this event, the British reinforcements under the command of Major General Sir Henry Havelock arrived, and retribution for the Kanpur killings began. Havelock's forces brutally suppressed the mutineers and civilians inhabiting Kanpur. Thousands of supposed conspirators were hung without trial, or blown from the cannons, a method of execution made famous by the Mughal Empire. This method of execution is when someone is strapped across the mouth of a cannon, which is then fired. This form of execution is not only insanely brutal, but culturally significant. Due to it obliterating the body, it meant burial rites could not be performed, and the punishment was viewed as extending into the afterlife. The Relief of Lucknow, May 1857 through November 1857. The commanding officer of Lucknow, Sir Henry Lawrence, was made aware of the sepoy uprisings throughout India, and in preparation began to fortify his residency. With a garrison of around 1,600 soldiers, his force dug in and prepared for the pending assault. The assault began in late May of 1857 when sepoy soldiers attempted to take the fortified residency. The initial attack was unsuccessful, and a war of attrition began, with constant artillery barrages being directed at the fortified position. The siege lasted for 90 days, ultimately killing Sir Henry Lawrence and reducing the British force to around 600 soldiers and 500 civilians. In late September of 1857, a relief force led by Sir Henry Havelock fought its way from Kanpur to Lucknow and joined the besieged garrison of British troops. With the bolstered garrison, British forces were able to execute a tactical retreat and started heading back to Kanpur, which had once again fallen to sepoy forces. Henry Havelock and the forces of Lucknow were able to successfully retake Kanpur, but Lucknow had been lost. It was not until March of 1858 that a British force under the command of Sir Colin Campbell was able to return and retake the city of Lucknow. Nobility of Jhansi. Jhansi was a Maratha-ruled princely state. When Raja of Jhansi died in 1853 without a biological male heir, the state was annexed by the East India Trade Company under the doctrine of lapsed. This decision was feverishly protested by Raja of Jhansi's widow, Rani Lakshmi Bai, known as Rani of Jhansi. She asserted her adopted son was the rightful heir to the princely state. When rebellion broke out in 1857, Rani of Jhansi led rebel forces and retook her territory. Rani of Jhansi held the territory until March of 1858, when a British force under the command of Major General Sir Hugh Rose besieged Jhansi. For 2 weeks, bitter fighting ensued until British forces breached the walls of the city. Once the city was secured, the British slaughtered the local population, killing all adult males in the city, with the final death toll of sepoys exceeding 5,000. Despite the ruthless pursuit of the British, Rani of Jhansi was able to escape to Gwalior. Gwalior, the twilight of a rebellion. Rani of Jhansi arrived in Gwalior to find it occupied by forces led by Nana Sahib. She attempted to persuade them to fortify their position for what she believed was a pending assault. When her requests fell on deaf ears, she left the city. 3 days later, her predictions came true, and the city of Gwalior was taken by the British shortly thereafter. Just outside the city of Gwalior, at Kota Ki Sarai, Rani of Jhansi was fatally wounded by a British rifleman. The Sepoy Mutiny is an event with substantial historical implications. The rebellion cost hundreds of thousands of lives between military and civilian casualties. It saw the death of the Mughal Empire, with Bahadur Shah having his lineage stamped out with the execution of his sons, and living the remainder of his life in exile. The mutiny was the first step in the dissolution of the East India Trading Company, with the Government of India Act transferring control of the country to Queen Victoria in 1858. The Sepoy Mutiny saw a number of anti-colonial figures such as Mangal Pandey and Rani of Jhansi, who would inspire modern anti-colonial movements well beyond 1857. Thank you for joining us, and this has been another episode of Phalanx History.